Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world. I want you to just try to imagine a specific scenario for a second.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Right. So let's say a city has this stable native population. And over the course of, I don't know, a decade or so, 10,000 of those native citizens leave. Or, maybe their birth rates drop and they just aren't replaced.
Yeah, demographic decline happens all the time.
Exactly. So at the exact same time, 10,000 immigrants arrive to fill that economic gap. Now, if you look at the census data, right, or the tax records or the city's GDP, the math is perfectly balanced.
Right, 10,000 out, 10,000 in, net change is zero.
It changes zero. But what if I told you that from a strictly, biological perspective, depending entirely on who those immigrants are, that exact same scenario could result in the mathematical equivalent of the native population losing over 10,000 children.
I mean, it sounds like an impossible paradox, right? To the modern sort of bureaucratic mind, a body is a body, a worker is a worker. But underneath that administrative surface, there's this entirely different ledger being kept. It's a ledger of genetic continuity that basically operates on rules that are completely invisible to our modern institutions.
And that invisible ledger is exactly what we're going to open up today. We've been designing this deep dive specifically for you, the listener, who wants to look past the surface level political debates you constantly see on the news.
Yeah, the typical talking points.
Right, the stuff that just goes in circles. We want to understand the hidden, often totally unspoken, biological architectures that are operating right beneath our feet. The ones driving human behavior in ways we, quite frankly, rarely acknowledge.
And to do that, today we are pulling from a really provocative, deeply analytical source text. It's a book called On Genetic Interests, Family, Ethnicity, and Humanity by Frank Salter.
Yeah, and it's a text that fundamentally reorganizes how you view demographics. I mean, it really shifts the paradigm.
It does. Salter's core argument is that genetic continuity is ultimately the most basic, long-term biological interest of literally any organism. But he takes it a massive step further.
Which is where it gets really interesting.
Exactly. He argues that this interest extends way beyond just you as an individual, and even beyond your immediate nuclear family out into much larger populations. Specifically, he looks at ethnic groups, which he frames as these massive, mathematically quantifiable stores of shared genetic interest.
So we have a very specific analytical arc mapped out for you today. We're going to map the primary system where these ancient biological forces interact with the modern world. We'll explore the real collision point between evolutionary incentives, kin selection, ethnic identity, demographic change, and modern political institutions.
Right, how they all smash into each other.
Yeah. We're going to look at how this biological system is actually designed, the behavioral incentives driving it, and its highly predictable structural outcomes, including that sort of mind-bending math paradox I mentioned in the hook.
We'll definitely explain the math on that.
Yes, we have to. And then we'll look at why this system persists despite the incredible friction it causes, and finally, how it interconnects with global macro-level institutions.
It's basically a comprehensive systems analysis. We are taking the hood off the human political engine to see how the biological gears are turning.
Now, before we jump into the actual mechanics of this, let's unpack a really necessary boundary. The source material today touches on some highly charged, intensely debated topics.
Very charged.
Yeah. We're talking about race, mass migration, assimilation, genetics. So it is absolutely vital to state right up front. We aren't here to take a side.
Not at all.
We aren't endorsing any political viewpoint, and we certainly aren't making moral judgments about how society should be run. Our goal today is strictly to map the system that Salter describes. We want you to understand the structural arguments presented in the text, just so you can see the architecture of his theory clearly.
And that boundary is really essential for the kind of analysis we do here. I mean, think of it like we're acting as systems analysts, right? If we were engineers studying why a bridge collapsed, we wouldn't sit there and judge gravity as, immoral for pulling the steel down.
Right, gravity's just doing what gravity does.
Exactly. We would simply map the physical forces at play. And here, we are mapping the biological and demographic forces that Salter argues are placing immense structural strain on modern nation-states.
Okay, so let's start at the very foundation.
Yeah.
The design. To really grasp how modern institutions clash with human nature, we first have to understand how that nature was biologically designed over millions of years, right?
Yeah, you have to start with the biology.
So the text makes this really fundamental distinction right out of the gate between two concepts, ultimate interests and proximate interests. And honestly, this seems like the skeleton key to Salter's entire framework. So walk me through that. How does this distinction actually work?
It really is the skeleton key. So, in evolutionary biology, an ultimate interest is essentially the survival and replication of genetic information across time. From a strict, Darwinian perspective, genes are the basic units of selection.
Right.
They are the active replicators. A proximate interest, on the other hand, is an immediate, localized desire or drive. Think of the urge to survive a physical threat, the pursuit of happiness, the desire for social status, or even just the instinct to avoid pain.
So if I'm understanding this, the proximate interest is the immediate feeling I experience in my body or mind, but the ultimate interest is the cold biological goal that the feeling was evolved to serve in the first place.
That is exactly the mechanism at work. I mean, think about why you eat a meal. You eat because you feel the sensation of hunger and, eating tastes good. That is the proximate interest.
Right, a cheeseburger tastes good, so I eat it.
Exactly, but your genes don't care about your culinary enjoyment. The ultimate interest being served by that sensation of hunger is keeping your physical body alive long enough to reproduce and pass those genes on to the next generation.
So hunger is just a trick to keep the machine running.
Basically, yeah. Evolutionary biologist Edward O. Wilson, whose work Salter actually builds heavily upon, he noted that human brain structures, specifically the hypothalamus and the limbic system, are literally engineered by evolution to perpetuate DNA.
It really reminds me of Richard Dawkins' concept of the selfish gene. The idea that we as human beings, with all our complex emotions and our grand civilizations, are essentially just temporary fleshy vehicles built by our genes to ensure their own immortal replication.
Dawkins' framing is crucial here, yeah. In this paradigm, the human being, what biologists call the phenotype, is just the vehicle. The genes are the passengers. And the passengers have designed the vehicle's navigation system, our proximate desires, to keep them on the road.
Okay, that makes sense.
Now, for a really long time, evolutionary biology assumed that the only way to advance your ultimate genetic interest was to have direct offspring. You pass your genes to your kids, they pass them to their kids, and so on.
Right, the standard evolutionary model.
But this assumption hit a massive wall when biologists started observing behaviors in nature that just didn't fit that model.
What kind of behaviors? What were they seeing?
Extreme altruism. Biologists saw insects, birds, and even mammals sacrificing their own lives or giving up their own chance to reproduce entirely just to help others in their group.
Which seems totally counterproductive.
Exactly. If the only goal is to pass on your direct genes, dying for someone else is a catastrophic Darwinian failure. It made absolutely no mathematical sense. That is, until a massive breakthrough in 1964 by a biologist named W.D. Hamilton.
And this is where the concept of inclusive fitness comes in, right? I know this is a pretty heavy technical concept, so let's really break it down for the listener. What exactly did Hamilton prove?
Hamilton proved that an individual's genetic interests are advanced not just by having direct offspring, but by helping kin reproduce. He introduced this mathematical formula showing that because your family members share a very high concentration of your distinctive genes, ensuring their survival is functionally the same as ensuring your own genetic survival.
There's a famous historical anecdote about this, isn't there? The evolutionary biologist J.B.S. Haldane sitting in a pub doing math on the back of an envelope.
Yes, yeah. The story goes that Haldane was asked by someone if he would give his life to save a drowning brother. And after running the math in his head, or on a napkin, he reportedly quipped that he would gladly lay down his life for 2 brothers or 8 cousins.
I want to pause and really look at the math behind that joke, because I feel like it explains the whole theory. Why specifically 2 brothers or 8 cousins?
Because of the percentage of distinctive genes you share by common descent, you share roughly 50% of your distinctive genes with a full sibling. So 2 siblings equal 100% of your distinctive genetic variance.
Okay, 50 plus 50.
Right. And you share 12.5% of your distinctive genes with a first cousin. Therefore, 8 cousins multiply out to 100%. So from the cold, calculating perspective of your ultimate genetic interest, your genes literally do not care if they survive inside your specific body, just so long as identical copies of them survive in the bodies of your relatives.
Wow.
Yeah, saving 2 siblings or 8 cousins is mathematically equivalent to saving yourself.
That is just wild to think about because, we experience love and loyalty for our family, which is a warm, proximate feeling. But beneath that warmth is this utterly ruthless biological equation. calculating genetic profit and loss.
It's all math under the hood.
Right. Okay, so I grasp how inclusive fitness works at the dinner table, within a family. But Salter scales this concept up massively in the text. He introduces the term ethny, which is his word for an ethnic group, and he describes it as an extended genetic repository. How on earth does the math of 8 cousins scale up to millions of people in an ethnic group?
So this is where Salter bridges anthropology and population genetics. He builds on the work of Pierre van den Burre, who basically argued that ethnic groups are quite literally just extended families.
Really? Just really big families.
Exactly. Because for the vast majority of human history, populations did not travel far. They engaged in what's called assortative mating, meaning they bred within their own localized geographic groups for thousands and thousands of years.
So they were isolated by, like, mountains, oceans, or just sheer physical distance?
Yes, exactly. And when a population breeds within itself for millennia, it becomes highly genetically related. The entire group becomes a web of distant cousins. Salter argues that an ethne is really just a concentric circle of genetic relatedness moving outward.
Okay, visual aid time.
Right, so you have your nuclear family in the very center, then your extended family in the next ring, your clan or tribe in the next, and finally your ethne encompassing them all on the outer ring.
I was trying to visualize this while reading the book, and I came up with an analogy. Let me know if this tracks. If my immediate family is my checking account of genes like, it's highly concentrated, the balance is super obvious, and it's easily accessible, is my ethne essentially a massive collective mutual fund of those exact same genes?
Oh, that's good. Let's explore that analogy because it captures the dynamic perfectly. In your checking account, your nuclear family, the concentration of your distinctive genes is 50% per person. It's very high. In your ethne, the mutual fund, the concentration of your distinctive genes in any one random stranger who shares your ethnicity might be very, very small, perhaps equivalent to a distant cousin.
Right, so any individual stock in that mutual fund doesn't hold much of my wealth.
Exactly, but the scale changes the math entirely. Your checking account only has 3 or 4 people in it. The mutual fund contains millions of people. When you aggregate that tiny percentage of shared distinctive genes across a population of, say, 10 million cello-ethnics, the sheer volume of your distinctive genes held in that broader population completely dwarfs what is held in your immediate family.
So the total volume is just massively large.
Right. Your ethne holds a staggering amount of your ultimate biological wealth.
Now, I have to push back here because this is the exact point where a lot of modern listeners, myself included, will hit a wall. Science constantly tells us that human beings share something like 99.9% of our DNA. We share a massive amount of DNA with chimpanzees, and I've even heard we share a significant amount with, like, bananas.
You do, yeah.
So if we are all universally carrying the exact same basic human genetic portfolio, how can an ethne be considered a biologically distinct mutual fund? Aren't we all just pulling from the exact same global gene pool?
That is the most common and perhaps the most important objection to this entire framework. But it relies on a misunderstanding of how evolution actually operates. Salter addresses this directly using Dawkins' logic. It is absolutely true that we share the vast majority of our genes with the entire human species, and indeed with all mammals.
Right.
Those are the ubiquitous genes that dictate we have one heart, 2 lungs, a central nervous system, and so on.
It's basically the baseline operating system of being a mammal.
Right. But evolution does not operate on ubiquitous genes. Those genes are part of the background environment. They are not at risk. If one human population goes completely extinct and is completely replaced by another, the genes for having 2 lungs do not disappear from the world.
Oh.
What is at risk and what evolution ruthlessly selects for are the distinctive frequencies of alleles.
Let's ELI5 that term. Explain alleles like I'm 5.
Okay, imagine the human genome is a massive textbook, say 10,000 pages long. Every human being on Earth has the exact same textbook. That's the 99.9% similarity. However, on certain pages and certain paragraphs, there are slight spelling variations.
Like typos.
More like localized edits. Some populations have a C where another population has a T. Those spelling variations are alleles. They are the tiny, highly specific genetic variations that have adapted over millennia to specific climates, diets, and environments. They dictate things like physical appearance, disease resistance, and potentially deeply ingrained behavioral and cognitive traits.
Ah, I see the distinction now. So the biological mutual fund isn't holding the universal textbook. It is specifically designed to protect the unique spelling variations, that margin of difference, that makes that specific lineage unique?
You've hit the exact core of it. Salter defines a person's genetic interest not as their entire genome, but strictly as the copies of their distinctive genes. Ubiquitous genes are safe. Distinctive allele frequencies are fragile.
That can be overwritten.
Exactly. They are concentrated in families and, on a macro level, in ethnies. Therefore, biologically speaking, the design of the human organism is fundamentally tethered to preserving those distinctive gene frequencies in the broader population.
Okay, so if that biological design is true, if we are fundamentally tethered to protecting that mutual fund, it perfectly sets up the second phase of our analysis, the incentive architecture. Because if you have an organism designed to preserve an extended genetic family, that design must generate some incredibly powerful behavioral incentives.
It absolutely does.
And from what I'm gathering, those ancient incentives are violently colliding with the way our modern world is structured today.
They are on a direct collision course. To understand why this friction is so intense, we have to look at the environment where our human behavioral incentives actually evolved. Evolutionary psychologists call this the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness, or the EEA.
The EEA, right.
We need to remember that for roughly 99% of human history, we did not live in cities or even villages. We lived in small, nomadic, hunter-gatherer bands of maybe 50 to 150 people.
Which is often referred to as Dunbar's number, right? The cognitive limit to the number of people with whom we can actually maintain stable social relationships.
Exactly right. In that ancestral environment, almost every single person you interacted with on a daily basis was closely related to you. The group was the family.
So in that specific environment, nepotism-like favoring your tribe over a neighboring tribe wasn't a moral failing. It was literally a mathematical imperative to protect your genes.
It was the only evolutionary stable strategy. Think about the incentives. Reproductive success, intense kin preference, fierce loyalty to the tribe, and a deep suspicion or even hostility toward outgroups who might compete for scarce territory or hunting grounds.
Because losing meant genetic death.
Right. These weren't learned cultural prejudices. They were deeply ingrained, naturally selected survival mechanisms. The human brain evolved to direct its altruism, its trust, and its cooperative behavior toward people who shared its distinctive genes.
But wait, how did the brain know who shared its genes before we could sequence DNA? I mean, they didn't have 23andMe back then.
No, they didn't, so it relied on proxies. The brain learned to identify genetic kinship through phenotypic markers. These are observable traits: physical appearance, bone structure, skin tone, but also behavioral markers like shared language, shared dialect, and shared cultural norms.
Because 50,000 years ago, if someone looked like you, spoke your highly localized dialect, and knew your tribe's specific rituals, there was a 99.9% chance they were a member of your genetic mutual fund.
Exactly. Those phenotypic markers were highly reliable proxies for blood. So the brain evolved to reward you with a proximate feeling of safety, trust, and belonging when you were surrounded by your own kind. The proximate incentive, feeling good around familiar faces, was working perfectly to serve the ultimate genetic interest, which is protecting your distinctive alleles.
Wow. I'm really starting to see the sheer scale of the mismatch here. We are taking an organism with a brain explicitly hardwired over millions of years to run a highly localized kinship-based tribal network, and we are dropping that exact same organism into the middle of modern London or New York or Tokyo.
That is the institutional mismatch at the very heart of Salter's analysis. The modern administrative state, globalized free markets, massive bureaucratic systems, these represent a completely novel, alien environment to the human brain. These institutions do not, and honestly cannot, operate on kinship.
Because to function at a mass scale, to manage tens of millions of people, modern institutions have to flatten everyone into a universal standard. They have to frame human beings in universal, interchangeable terms.
Let's look at how the modern state views you. To the IRS, you are not a carrier of distinctive alleles, you are a taxpayer. To a massive global corporation, you are a unit of labor and a consumer of products. You are, for all systemic intents and purposes, an interchangeable cog in an economic machine.
Or protocol on a massive centralized cloud server. The mesh network, which is our biology, relies on close proximity and verified trusted nodes, which is kinship. But the centralized server, the modern state, just sees IP addresses. It doesn't care about the node's history. It just needs them to transmit data efficiently.
That's a great way to put it. And that creates immense structural tension. The institutions require a universal interchangeable view of populations to function efficiently. But the human organism operating within those institutions is still biologically incentivized at a subconscious level to look for shared blood and phenotypic similarity to direct its deepest loyalties.
I'm struggling a bit with the temporal aspect of this, though. We've built these massive universal institutions fairly recently, historically speaking. Why hasn't our biology adapted to the new environment? Why don't we just evolve to be universalist, interchangeable citizens?
Well, it comes down to the rate of change. Biological evolution is agonizingly slow. It takes thousands of generations to alter fundamental behavioral hardwiring. Technological and cultural change, however, moves at lightning speed.
Right, we went from horse-drawn carriages to the internet in just a few generations.
Exactly. Because of this incredibly rapid environmental shift, our proximate incentives, what feels good or what modern culture tells us is right, have become dangerously decoupled from our ultimate genetic interests.
Can you give me a specific example of that decoupling?
Sure, consider universal humanism. Modern culture and institutions heavily promote indiscriminate altruism, the idea that we should feel an equal level of charity and loyalty to a stranger on the other side of the planet as we do to our next-door neighbor.
Which, culturally, we view as a huge moral triumph.
Culturally, yes. But from the cold Darwinian perspective of your distinctive genes, applying indiscriminate altruism in a mass, anonymous society is a maladaptive misfire. You are spending your biological resources, your time, energy, wealth on individuals who do not share your distinctive alleles, which mathematically weakens the competitive advantage of your own genetic mutual fund.
Okay, so if you force this Pleistocene, biologically evolved tribal organism into modern institutions that treat humans as interchangeable economic units, what happens? The text outlines some very predictable, deeply structural outcomes. And this brings us to the most difficult, math-heavy part of the deep dive.
Yeah, the demographics.
Right. Slaughter focuses heavily on demographics, migration, and the concept of territory. Why is territory so central to this biological system?
In Salter's framework, territory is the ultimate collective good. It is the fortress that protects the mutual fund. For an ethne, holding a monopoly over a specific, defined territory is the primary mechanism that insulates its gene pool from demographic replacement.
Why does a monopoly on territory matter so much, though? If an ethne is just a web of genes, why does it need physical land?
Because land provides carrying capacity. A territory can only support so many people before resources like housing, food, water, infrastructure become completely scarce. If an ethne controls its borders and maintains its territory, it can survive immense historical traumas.
Like what?
Like plagues, famines, devastating wars. Its absolute population numbers might drop precipitously, but because it holds the territory, its relative genetic frequencies remain completely intact. When the plague passes, the survivors will repopulate the territory, and the distinctive genetic mutual fund is preserved. Territory guarantees long-term genetic continuity.
But if they lose control of that territory, they lose the ability to protect that mutual fund of genes from being diluted. Which brings us to the mathematics of migration. I really need you to walk me and the listener through this because the numbers in the text are just staggering. Earlier in the intro, I mentioned a paradox. 10,000 people leave, 10,000 arrive, but the biological ledger shows a massive loss.
Right, the migration math.
Salter uses a metric called FST distances to prove this. What is an FST distance and how does it apply to migration?
So FST distances, or fixation index distances, are a standard metric used in population genetics. Without getting bogged down in the really complex formulas, an FST distance essentially measures the genetic variance between two different populations.
Okay.
It quantifies how genetically distinct one group is from another based on those distinctive alleles we discussed earlier. Salter uses this precise data to calculate the actual biological cost of migration to a native population.
Okay, let's set up the scenario from the book. Let's say we have an English population living in its native territory of England.
Right. Now imagine a scenario where 10,000 native English people leave the territory, or perhaps they simply fail to reproduce and their numbers drop by 10,000. The territory now has 10,000 empty slots in its carrying capacity.
The greenhouse has some empty plots.
Exactly. To fill the labor shortage, the state brings in 10,000 immigrants from Denmark. What is the genetic cost to the English ethne?
Well, historically and genetically, the English and the Danes are very similar. They are closely related European ethnies with a long history of overlapping populations.
Exactly. Because they are so closely related, the FST distance, the genetic variance between the English and the Danes, is tiny. Salter runs the mathematical formula and calculates that replacing 10,000 English with 10,000 Danes results in a relatively small loss of the distinctive English gene frequencies. Mathematically, it is the equivalent of the English population losing 167 children.
Let me stop and just make sure I understand the mechanics of this. 10,000 physical English people are gone. But because the 10,000 Danes who arrived carry so many of the exact same distinctive alleles, they're basically genetic cousins, the actual loss to the English Genetic Mutual Fund is heavily mitigated. The ledger only registers a loss of 167 child equivalents.
That is exactly the math. The high degree of shared distinctive genes buffers the biological loss. But look what happens when the replacement involves a population with a large FST distance.
Okay.
Suppose those 10,000 English people are not replaced by Danes. Suppose they are replaced by 10,000 immigrants from a completely different geographic race. In Salter's example, he uses a Bantu population from sub-Saharan Africa. The FST distance here is vast.
And what is the mathematical loss to the English genetic interest in that specific scenario?
The genetic loss is massive. Replacing 10,000 English with 10,000 Bantu is the genetic equivalent of the English population losing 10,854 children.
Wait, let's slow down. 10,854. I need to understand the physical mechanics of this. How can the genetic loss be larger than the actual number of people replaced? If 10,000 people are replaced, how do you lose more than 10,000 child equivalents? Make it make sense.
It seems counterintuitive, almost impossible, until you remember that we are counting genes, not individual bodies. And we have to factor in that concept of carrying capacity. Think of the territory as a communal greenhouse with a finite amount of soil and water.
Okay, a greenhouse with limited resources.
If 10,000 native English plants die, you've lost the genes of those plants. That's a baseline loss. Now, if you plant 10,000 Bantu plants in their exact place, you haven't just failed to replenish the English genes, you have actively introduced a massive amount of what Salter calls negative kinship.
Negative kinship.
Yes, distinctive alleles that are fundamentally different from the native ones. You've introduced them into the greenhouse. Those new plants are now consuming the finite soil and water, the carrying capacity, that would otherwise be available for future English descendants to utilize.
Oh, I see. It's a double blow. You lose your own genetic carriers, and the space they occupied is filled by genetic competitors, which lowers the probability that your remaining genes can ever expand back into that space.
Precisely. You are losing the distinctive genes of the 10,000 who left, plus you are permanently altering the genetic makeup of the territory's future carrying capacity. The mathematical sum of that biological displacement equals the loss of 10,854 children.
This is a profoundly heavy concept. I want to make sure I'm framing this correctly for the listener. Salter isn't talking about hostile armies marching across a border, burning villages, and conquering territory by force, right? He is saying that mathematically, even completely peaceful, economically beneficial migration structurally acts as genetic competition.
There's a really critical distinction to make there, yes. Salter completely strips away intent, malice, or economic utility. The immigrants could be wonderful, peaceful, highly educated, incredibly productive people who double the GDP of the city.
Right, model citizens.
But biology is entirely blind to economic intent. Structurally, if a territory has a finite carrying capacity, replacing a native population with a genetically distant population mathematically dilutes the distinctive gene pool of the native ethne. In strict Darwinian terms, regardless of how friendly the interaction is, it acts as an assault on their ultimate genetic interests.
And this reveals why identity conflict and ethnic friction become structurally inevitable in modern systems. We have two completely different realities layered on top of each other. The political system treats populations as interchangeable moral communities.
Right.
The state says it doesn't matter where you or your ancestors came from, as long as you pay taxes and obey the law, you are a citizen, you are interchangeable. But biologically, the populations are distinct genetic lineages engaging in an invisible, zero-sum competition for carrying capacity.
You've hit the core tension. The modern state formally penalizes ethnic nepotism. We have laws against discrimination, we champion diversity, and we view ethnic favoritism as a moral failing. But biologically, the organism is still rewarded for it by its evolved brain.
The state says interchangeable, but the biology says kinship.
And when the state ignores this biological mismatch, it actually intensifies the conflict. By treating human beings purely as Homo economicus, the state continually subjects the native population to demographic transformation.
Right.
When the native population feels the proximate distress of this transformation, the loss of social trust, the alienation of walking down a street where no one speaks their language or shares their phenotypic markers, the state treats this distress as mere irrational prejudice or a failure of education rather than a completely predictable biological alarm system going off.
Which perfectly brings us to Section 4, feedback loops and institutional reinforcement. Because if this mismatch causes such intense structural friction, if people are mathematically losing the equivalent of millions of children from their genetic mutual fund on a national scale, the obvious question is, why do modern nations allow this? Why does the system persist? Why don't the institutions adapt to the biological reality?
To answer that, we must map the feedback loops that keep this dynamic locked in place and understand how the traditional loop has been basically broken.
Okay, let's map it.
Let's look at how the system functioned historically. Biology naturally shaped culture. The kinship bonds and shared alleles of a localized tribe created tribal cultures, shared languages, and specific behavioral norms.
Culture was essentially an emergent property of the biology.
Exactly. Then, that culture shaped identity narratives, the myths of common ancestry, the stories of national heroes, the deep sense of national pride. Finally, those identity narratives shaped policy. The policy naturally reflected the biology. Citizenship laws were based on bloodline, what they called jus sanguinis, and borders were defended to protect the ethne.
That's the traditional loop. Biology informs culture, culture informs identity, identity informs policy. But today, it seems like the loop is running in reverse, or it's been hijacked entirely.
It has been structurally inverted. Today, universalist policy, often driven by the demands of global corporations for cheap labor or ideological commitments to multiculturalism, reshapes the demographic reality on the ground through mass migration. The policy artificially forces a completely new, highly diverse demographic reality. This new reality then feeds back into human perception.
It disrupts the organism's natural environment.
Yes, it triggers that Pleistocene alarm system. It disrupts feelings of belonging and deeply erodes social trust. The famous sociological research by Robert Putnam confirmed this. As diversity in a community increases, civic trust plummets. People hunker down.
Right, they isolate.
This altered perception then drives volatile political behavior, populist uprisings, intense polarization, tribal voting patterns. But the system persists despite all this friction because of the moral language of society and the institutional norms that act as blinders.
Let's talk about those blinders, because Salter points out a massive societal taboo here. Modern Western societies have profound difficulty even discussing biological explanations for human behavior.
It's a huge taboo.
Yeah, if a sociologist or a politician brings up ethnic genetic interests in a modern public setting, it almost immediately collapses into a moral panic, accusations of bigotry, or just total denial. Why is the diagnostic tool of biology considered so taboo?
We must understand why that panic exists, and Salter is very clear about the historical context here. The taboo is deeply rooted in the severe traumas of 20th century history, the eugenics movement, industrialized racial warfare, the horrors of the Holocaust. These events cast a long, dark shadow over the West. The intellectual left and modern institutions broadly developed a highly justified, profound fear of biological determinism.
They saw what happened when state power was married to biological categorization, and they recoil from it.
Understandably so. But Salter argues that in reacting to those historical horrors, our institutions overcorrected. They swung the pendulum entirely to the opposite extreme, adopting a blank slate view of human nature. They decided that since biological framing was dangerous, human biology must simply not matter in the realm of culture and politics.
I'm trying to think of an analogy for this. It's like a structural engineer designing a massive skyscraper, but refusing to look at the metallurgical properties of this, like the varying tensile strengths, the load-bearing differences, because they have an ideological belief that all metals are fundamentally equal and should be treated identically.
That's a great comparison.
The intent might be noble, but the structural friction is real, and eventually the building is going to groan under the weight.
That is a very apt analogy for Salter's critique. By ignoring the metallurgical properties of human nature, you don't erase them, you just make your engineering structurally unsound. Salter introduces a philosophical concept to explain how this intellectual blinder operates in our institutions. He calls it adaptive utilitarianism.
How does adaptive utilitarianism work?
It's rooted in classical utilitarianism, the philosophy of thinkers like Jeremy Bentham. Utilitarianism assumes a general harmony of interests. It posits that the goal of society is simply to maximize happiness and minimize pain for the greatest number of people. It assumes that if everyone just follows the laws, engages in free trade, and seeks proximate happiness, everyone wins.
Because classical utilitarianism treats everyone as an interchangeable unit capable of experiencing happiness. It looks strictly at proximate interests, wealth, comfort, safety, and completely ignores ultimate genetic competition.
Exactly. Because our modern institutions, our legal codes, our economic models, our welfare states are entirely built on this classical universalist utilitarian model. They structurally deny the reality of ethnic genetic competition. They are literally immune to biological feedback.
They just can't process the data.
Right. When ethnic friction arises, the institutions rely purely on cultural or economic explanations. They blame it on poverty or lack of education or bad socialization. They completely ignore the biological leash pulling on the population.
And ignoring the biological leash doesn't make it disappear. It just means it pulls you in the dark and you have no idea why you're constantly tripping over it. So if this local feedback loop is locked in this state of denial, how does it connect to global macro systems? Because this local tension inside a single nation doesn't exist in a vacuum. Let's explore Section 5, interconnection and nested systems.
Right, the macro view.
Salter proposes a geopolitical concept here called universal nationalism. What is that, and how does it relate to the biological mutual fund?
Salter proposes universal nationalism as the only evolutionarily stable strategy for a globalized world. He describes it essentially as the golden rule applied internationally. It is the idea that nation-states should act explicitly as an ethnic group strategy. In this model, the state's primary legitimate function is to protect the genetic continuity and the territory of its majority native ethne, while simultaneously respecting the rights of all other states to do the exact same thing for their respective ethnies.
So it's a model of mutual biological respect. Germany for the Germans, Japan for the Japanese, Nigeria for the Nigerians. It aligns the artificial political boundary with the natural biological boundary, creating a safe greenhouse for every mutual fund.
Yes. In Salter's view, this is the optimal way to maximize global adaptiveness and prevent the zero-sum destruction of genetic interests that mass migration causes. But look at how this interacts with the global systems dominating the world today. Modern liberal institutions, global free markets, human rights discourse, international migration regimes like the UN compacts, they operate on the exact opposite principle. They actively advocate for porous borders, the free movement of labor, and universal interchangeability.
And the text points out that these globalized porous systems rely heavily on what evolutionary biologists call free riders. Can you explain how a biological free rider operates in a macro-institutional sense?
In an evolutionary ecosystem, a free rider is an organism that extracts benefits from a collective good without contributing to the maintenance of that good. Salter synthesizes this concept by showing how modern multiculturalism and globalized labor markets allow for systemic demographic free riding.
Let's ground this in a specific example. How does a migrant act as a free rider in this biological framework? And again, keeping in mind, we are looking at the structure, not the moral intent of the individual.
Sure. Imagine a high-trust, homogeneous society, say the Scandinavian country in the mid-20th century. That high-trust society, with its robust welfare systems, safe streets, and strong civic institutions, did not emerge out of nowhere. It was built over centuries by the dense kinship bonds, the shared behavioral alleles, and the evolutionary sacrifices of the native ethne.
Right.
The society is the extended phenotype of that specific genetic mutual fund.
The culture is the physical manifestation of their shared biology.
Right. Now, when global institutions push for porous borders, individuals or migrating populations from genetically distant ethnies can enter that high-trust society. They can extract the economic benefits, utilize the welfare systems, and enjoy the safety of that society without sharing the genetic lineage that built it, and crucially, without contributing to the long-term genetic continuity of the founding population.
In fact, mathematically, as we discussed with the greenhouse analogy and the FST distances earlier, their very presence by occupying carrying capacity structurally damages the genetic continuity of the founders.
That's the mechanism at work. The migrants receive a massive proximate benefit, a better economy, safety, a higher standard of living, but the native population suffers a massive ultimate biological cost. The global system facilitates this transfer of wealth, entirely blind to the biological liquidation taking place.
But I have to challenge this premise, because hasn't human history always been a story of mixing, conquest, and migration? I mean, human populations have never been entirely static. The English themselves, the example we used earlier, are a historical mix of Angles, Saxons, Celts, and Normans. If mixing has always happened, is a pure nation-state even possible? Or is it just a theoretical construct that ignores the messy reality of history?
That is a vital counter-argument, and if we connect this to the bigger picture, Salter does not deny human history. He acknowledges that interbreeding and migration happen, and that over long periods of time, this mixing eventually creates entirely new ethnies. The English are indeed a hybrid ethne that stabilized over many centuries.
Right, so if the Angles and the Saxons could migrate and eventually form a stable English ethne, why is modern migration any different? Why does it cause such a structural crisis now?
The structural issue is the rate of change. Evolution, assimilation, and ethnogenesis, which is the creation of a new ethnic identity, they take hundreds, if not thousands, of years to stabilize. When populations mix slowly over millennia, the biological mutual fund has time to rebalance. A new evolutionary stable strategy forms.
So it's an issue of temporal velocity?
Exactly. Modern mass migration doesn't happen over millennia, it happens in decades. We are seeing demographic transformations that used to take thousands of years occurring within a single human lifetime. Rapid mass migration into a territory strips the native population of its evolutionary stable strategy before a new one has any time to form. It replaces the population so quickly that the biological organism experiences it as a catastrophic loss of fitness.
Because you aren't allowing the mutual fund to slowly rebalance its portfolio over generations. You are liquidating the assets overnight and replacing them with a completely different currency. The shock to the system is what causes the fracture.
And this rapid liquidation leads to the immediate breakdown of the society. Social fragmentation, the collapse of civic trust, intense political polarization, and the rise of reactive populist movements. And the tragedy from a systems perspective is that the global institutions, the multinational corporations demanding cheap labor, the NGOs advocating for borderless societies, are structurally blind to this biological shock.
Because they only look at proximate data.
They only see the proximate economic benefits. They see the GDP line going up and they assume the system is healthy, while the biological foundation rots right beneath it.
Which brings us to the ultimate synthesis of our deep dive today. We have traced this from the deepest biological design of the selfish gene, through the tribal incentives of the Pleistocene brain, into the mathematical outcomes of demographic replacement, up through the institutional taboos that blind us, and finally into the macro geopolitical systems. We have mapped the entire engine. So looking at this vast interconnected system, I have to explicitly ask you, what is the crisis in perception here?
This is the core of the issue, the exact point where the breakdown occurs. The crisis in perception is a fundamental structural blindness built into the architecture of modern society. What is being misperceived is human nature itself. Modern political and economic systems misperceive populations as blank slates. They look at human beings merely as interchangeable economic units or malleable cultural constructs that can be swapped across borders without consequence.
And what structural layer is being completely obscured by that misperception?
The ultimate biological reality is obscured. The reality that humans are not just economic consumers, they are evolved vehicles for genetic replication. And ethnies are not just cultural clubs you can join or leave, they are massive, mathematically quantifiable stores of those distinctive genes. Our institutions are literally blind to the most fundamental biological imperative of the organisms living inside them.
Which explains why the surface interpretations of our political turmoil fail so spectacularly.
Exactly. Surface interpretations rely solely on proximate interests. Politicians and economists look at GDP growth, individual happiness metrics, or the short-term economic gains from cheap migrant labor. They try to solve ethnic friction with tax credits or diversity training. They completely fail to account for the long-term ultimate biological costs to a population's genetic continuity. They measure the wealth of the economy, but they completely ignore the wealth of the gene pool.
And how does looking at this through a systems analysis using Salter's framework change our visibility?
By viewing this through a systems lens, we completely change how we interpret modern political friction. We see that moral panics, rising nationalism, and ethnic conflicts are not simply irrational prejudices that can be educated away. They are highly predictable structural frictions. They are the inevitable thermodynamic heat generated when an artificial system built on universal interchangeability violently collides with a biological organism hardwired for kin selection and genetic preservation.
It is the biological mesh network rejecting the universal cloud server. That is a profound way to map the structural reality of the text. It strips away the moralizing and forces us to look at the cold, hard mechanics of human nature.
It's the only way to clearly see the system.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with one final provocative thought to mull over as you watch the news or look at the changing demographics of your own city. If our deepest biological imperative, honed over millions of years of evolution, is genetic continuity, the preservation of our specific extended mutual fund of genes, and our modern global institutions are structurally blind to that imperative, are we building global systems that are fundamentally incompatible with human nature? And if we are forcing an immovable biological object against an unstoppable institutional force, which one will ultimately break first, the institutions or the biology?
That's the question we all have to face.
Crisis in Perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help us see clearly.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.